Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Super Metroid, an action-adventure platforming title developed by Nintendo and Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1994. We're going to look at that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. And we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at.
I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC Lewis W., Martin Steiner, James Nunn, Yuzu Soda, Vince Gameplays, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into Super Metroid, I figured it'd be a good idea to talk about why I chose Super Metroid for today's episode of the podcast. And the simple fact is, I didn't, because this is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one is sponsored by Steve. Steve did record a message for all of us to listen to about why Super Metroid means something to him. So Steve, take it away.
Hello everyone, this is Steve, and you might remember me from previous episodes like Goonies 2, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap. Oh, and if you're really listening closely, you might even remember Bizarro World Steve talking about the Ocarina of Time. Well, I'm back again, this time to sponsor Super Metroid. So, this game is responsible for me spending a lot of time at my high school girlfriend's house. Why do you ask? Well, back then, she had a Super Nintendo, and I did not. I had a Sega and a Nintendo. So, if I wanted to see the 16-bit revolution, specifically games like Donkey Kong Country and this masterpiece, Super Metroid, I had to be there every single day. It was a really great time sitting on her couch with her next to me playing video games. It was really worth it. I remember thinking Super Metroid was a perfect next step of the original. Playing Metroid on the NES, I remember leaving my console powered on overnight just to avoid dealing with those passwords. Super Metroid felt like a luxury in that regard. The save system was awesome, and I think just the gameplay and the enhanced graphics and everything else, it just was an adventure, and I loved it. So, a question for the group before I go, has anybody spent a lot of time at their girlfriend's house, or any friend's house, playing games because they had the systems and the games that you didn't? If so, be good to have a conversation out on Discord, so put your comments out there. And as always, before I go, I want to say thank you to Tony for putting this podcast and the community together. And thank you to all in the CGT universe. It is so great to be a part of such a fun and engaging community. Enjoy the show. And Tony, I hope you had fun playing Super Metroid.
Thank you, Steve, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. Interestingly, this is not the first time I've played Super Metroid. There are plenty of episodes that individuals sponsor where it's the first time I'm playing a game and I go in with completely wide open eyes. Super Metroid is not one of those experiences. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, oh, well, of course, Super Metroid is one of the classics, so to speak. So many people regard Super Metroid so highly. Of course, you must have played it when it first came out on the Super Nintendo, just like you must have played all of the other Metroids that are out there. But the simple fact is, that's not true. When I was younger, I didn't really play any of the Metroids. I have only been playing the Metroid series in semi-recent years. I want to say over the course of the last decade or so is where I really became introduced to the Metroid series. And Super Metroid in particular, I only really sat down to play for the first time, I want to say 2-3 years. No, it had to be longer than that. Probably 4 or 5 years ago or so, I sat down to play Super Metroid for the first time. So I had never played it before then. I knew of Metroid and I knew how people talked about it with such fondness, just the general series. But between Metroid, the original game, and then Super Metroid and Metroid Prime and all of the Prime series games and all that kind of stuff, I knew about them. And my real first exposure to Metroid was actually playing Metroid Samus Returns on the 3DS. I hadn't even played the original Metroid before I got Samus Returns, which was the remake of the original Metroid 2, which came out on the Game Boy. So after that, I had fired up the original Metroid. I'd already known about Samus's quote-unquote secret identity simply because that's widely known. And I had known about the fact, even beyond that, that Super Metroid was considered one of the best games of all time. I knew about the Metroidvania gaming genre. I knew how much of an influence Super Metroid had been on all of that and on just the gaming industry in general. And when I played Samus Returns, I loved it. I loved Samus Returns on the 3DS. So at that point, I decided to go back and play some of the other Metroids. I played through the original Metroid after that, and I mostly enjoyed it. I mean, I get why it's a classic, but at the time, I remember feeling like the exploration was a little bit haphazard, and the platforming was a little bit floaty, and the gameplay was just a little bit clunky. Certainly in comparison to Samus Returns and the smoothness of the gameplay in that title for the 3DS, the original was a good game, but I wasn't particularly blown away. I then skipped over Metroid 2 on the Game Boy for a very similar reason as to why I didn't really gravitate towards many portable versions of classic home console-based franchises back when I was younger, like the Mario series or the Zelda series. I just didn't think portable versions of those larger-than-life home console big-screen television games could possibly be as worthwhile as the less portable versions of the games. While I know that, at least in the case of Mario and Zelda, that I was totally wrong about that assumption back then, I still have yet to go back and play the original version of Metroid 2 on the Game Boy. And that was the game, like I mentioned, that was turned into Samus Returns for the 3DS. So I am super curious about going back to actually play that one eventually. Anyway, though, that then brings us up to Super Metroid, which around, like I said, 5, 6, maybe even 7 years ago, I decided to fire the game up because I had always heard about how much of a classic it was. And I was in a Metroid mood because I was playing other Metroid games. So I was really curious about how I would feel about it. After playing the game through to completion, I remember thinking to myself, well, okay, I guess that's cool. I mean, I recognized why it had received such acclaim over the years. I just wasn't fully convinced that this was really one of the best games of all time. Similar to some of my feelings about the original Metroid, I thought the exploration revolved just a bit too much around finding hidden paths and secrets. And while I appreciated the item and skill progression-based gameplay, I don't know that I would say that I actually loved the game. That being said, perspectives can change a lot over the years, and I fully recognize that the way I feel about certain games certainly changes over time, and can sometimes even be influenced by life events that are occurring when I'm playing a specific title. So, as I sat down to play Super Metroid for this episode of the podcast, I was going in with a fresh perspective, but also remained curious. Would Super Metroid today be a better experience than I remember it being years ago? Or would my initial impressions be validated with the recognition that Super Metroid is an important game, but not necessarily one of my personal favorite games? That is one of the questions we're going to try to answer as we begin diving deeper into Super Metroid. Super Metroid is an action-adventure platforming title developed by Nintendo and Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1994. To understand how Super Metroid came to be, we have to take a step back to talk about the origins of the Metroid series in general, an incredibly popular and influential gaming franchise that over the last 40-ish years has evolved from its fairly quaint two-dimensional action platforming origins to eventually birth an entirely new subgenre of gaming, while also making the leap to three-dimensional first-person adventuring, setting industry standards for engaging game design and gameplay mechanics in the process. But as with most things, Metroid didn't just spring into existence as a must-play blockbuster game franchise. No, as is often the case, Metroid began its life as a much smaller, though still ambitious, video game that its core design team hoped would appeal to the broader gaming community. To understand why the original Metroid was created in the first place, we need to take a slight detour to talk about the Nintendo of the mid-1980s, along with their overall perspective on how they could potentially dominate the home video game console market, a company focus that, interestingly, was a relatively new development, at least in comparison to Nintendo's overall lifespan. Nintendo as a company was originally founded in 1889, and its primary focus for decades following its founding was the creation of playing cards, followed in the 1960s by manufacturing a number of unique and innovative toys, a pivot partially driven by a chance encounter between legendary Nintendo engineer and designer Gunpei Yokoi and then Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi. At the time, Yokoi was working in one of Nintendo's manufacturing facilities, and in his spare time, he always liked to tinker and create miscellaneous devices with spare parts that might be lying around the facility. Not because he had any desire to invent an actual sellable product, but simply because he liked creating things. Well, one day in 1966, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi was touring one of the company's factories, and during that tour, he noticed a mechanical arm that someone had created in their spare time. When Yamauchi inquired about who had worked on the random toy-like device, he discovered that it was something Gunpei Yokoi had put together just for fun in between assembly line maintenance periods, literally just because he could. Yamauchi was both impressed and struck by inspiration, and asked Yokoi to develop the concept into a full-fledged toy, with the goal of having it ready for the upcoming Christmas holiday season. Yokoi got to work, and in short order developed the Ultra Hand, one of Nintendo's first toys, which ended up selling over 1 million units. The Ultra Hand would be a big deal for the company, as not only would it shift Nintendo's focus from playing cards to mechanical toys, but it would also launch Gunpei Yokoi's career, who in the following years would continue developing new toys for Nintendo, and over time would become the company's go-to person whenever an idea needed to be fleshed out, engineered into a sellable product, or in some cases, turned from a general concept into reality. Which is why, as Nintendo began pivoting yet again in the 1970s, this time from mechanical toys into the digital realm of video game creation, the company knew exactly who they could turn to. While we're not going to go over Yokoi's entire history of invention and innovation at the company, for the purposes of our discussion today, just recognize that Yokoi was instrumental in the creation of Nintendo's earliest video game efforts, and would effectively become one of Nintendo's first video game designers, eventually being recognized as the main creative force behind many of Nintendo's most popular products. Yokoi would be rewarded for his efforts by being named the head of Nintendo's first engineering and video game development group, known at the time as Nintendo Research and Development, which throughout the 70s and early 80s would be responsible for designing landmark arcade titles, launching home video game products, creating portable gaming devices like the Game & Watch, and incidentally, inventing the very first four-way directional pad, or D-pad, in history. As you might imagine, such a degree of creative and innovative output couldn't possibly be maintained by a single person, and I would argue that one of Yokoi's greatest strengths, beyond his own creativity, was that he knew how to cultivate creativity from others, and identify individuals that could, potentially, become legendary designers in their own right. And, of those talented individuals who got their start working in Yokoi's R&D 1 group, perhaps the most recognized and influential was none other than Shigeru Miyamoto. We have already discussed Miyamoto's origin story on several prior episodes of the podcast, but just to provide a brief refresher, Miyamoto had been working with Nintendo for several years before he got his first big break, the creation of an arcade conversion to save a potentially disastrous misstep by Nintendo that resulted in several thousand Radar Scope arcade machines sitting unused and unsold in a Nintendo of America warehouse. A call to action was put out across the company asking for any and all ideas for how to salvage this unsold inventory, and Shigeru Miyamoto answered the call with an idea that would eventually result in the creation of one of the most popular and profitable arcade cabinets in history, that being, of course, Donkey Kong. After the release of Donkey Kong, Shigeru Miyamoto, similar to Gunpei Yokoi before him, would become a Nintendo superstar, and from that point forward, Miyamoto would be promoted to lead his own research and development division in Nintendo, which was called R&D 4, while Yokoi and other talented members of Nintendo's R&D 1 division would independently continue creating blockbuster games, franchises, and hardware devices that would directly contribute to Nintendo dominating the home console space in the mid to late 80s. Nintendo would end up becoming the #1 console manufacturer on the planet, and while their 8-bit Famicom and NES hardware was impressive in comparison to then-current rivals, and certainly was more advanced than video game consoles that were a bit older, like the venerable Atari 2600, good hardware does not automatically equate to market-dominating performance. No, to truly dominate the video game market, you need good hardware and high-quality games. Luckily for Nintendo, the company had a stable of highly creative game designers on staff, like the individuals that made up Gunpei Yokoi's R&D 1 division and Shigeru Miyamoto's relatively new R&D 4 team. Specifically, the work that R&D 4 was doing would lead to the release of some of the most popular franchises in the entire video game industry, those being Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. When Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda were being created, the same team worked on both titles, with each game warranting specific considerations as to what design and gameplay mechanics would be suitable for each title. Super Mario Bros., as an example, was intended to represent the best possible platforming experience based on current game design paradigms, with a super smooth and intuitive gameplay loop supported by picture-perfect platforming coupled with tight controls that made players feel like every single action they took was represented exactly on the screen. The Legend of Zelda, by contrast, was intended to represent the future of game design, with much less hand-holding, a wide-open world full of secrets to uncover and puzzles to solve, and a degree of open-endedness to the game that not many titles had attempted to implement before. While both Zelda and Mario would be designed with different goals in mind, the end result was the same. Both games were blockbuster hits, and in the eyes of many, both Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda were the pinnacle of 8-bit gaming up to that point in history. The release of The Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Bros. Would change the trajectory of the company forever, and both titles would be huge feathers in the cap of Nintendo's R&D 4 division, one of the most talented groups of developers, designers, artists, engineers, and musicians in the entire company. The interesting thing, though, is that despite the fact that both titles were created by the same creative team at the same time, they were both dramatically different experiences, with one being a linear, tight platforming affair, and the other being an open-ended and exploration-centric experience, where players could effectively go wherever they wanted to go, whenever they wanted to go there, other than occasionally needing certain items to progress further into some areas in the game world. While the two games would end up appealing to different players for different reasons, one thing was clear. Both Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda were winning formulas that countless gamers loved. At this point, some of you might be wondering what would happen if the two formulas were somehow combined to create an experience that married tight platforming gameplay with an open and expansive world that encouraged players to explore every nook and cranny, hoping to find secrets, power-ups, and hidden encounters. Well, interestingly, that same exact thought occurred to the creative team at Gunpei Yokoi's R&D 1 division shortly after the release of both Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. As both of those landmark titles released on the market, the team at R&D 1 began thinking about the creation of their next game, and attention pretty quickly turned towards creating an action platforming kind of experience, complete with a protagonist who would shoot alien scum and ask questions later, and a world that just begged to be explored. The thought amongst the team was that if they could combine the ingenious designs of R&D 4's Super Mario and Zelda titles into a singular action-packed game with a brand new hero, or heroine, attempting to save the galaxy, then they themselves might have a hit on their hands. That goal of marrying Mario platforming and Zelda exploration is what would form the foundation of the very first game in the Metroid franchise, which released on the Famicom Disk System in Japan in August of 1986, with a North American release on the Nintendo Entertainment System following a year later in August of 1987. Creating Metroid would involve both current R&D1 staff as well as the company Intelligent Systems, an auxiliary team of talented software engineers who often worked closely with the R&D1 team to develop the tools and code that form the foundation of many of R&D1's most popular titles, while also acting as the team that handled porting responsibilities for many of the games that needed to be converted from Japan's disc-based Famicom Disk System to the rest of the world's cartridge-based Nintendo Entertainment System. While Intelligent Systems would often work a little bit in the shadows, so to speak, their contributions to R&D1's success were certainly noteworthy, and in the case of Metroid, they would be recognized as being co-developers of the title, alongside the core staff at R&D1. Anyway, the collective Metroid development team worked in a very free and open environment where literally any and all ideas were welcome. While there was a high-level design framework for the game that had been created before work on the title officially got underway, the way the team would get to that final design was completely open-ended, and it wasn't uncommon to have teammates from various departments, like, say, music, contribute game design ideas to the designers and artists working on creating the world, enemies, and characters in the game. In fact, one of Metroid's most significant design decisions, making lead protagonist Samus Aran a female heroine rather than the much more traditional male adventurer, came about because of a random comment that someone on the team made during a collaboration and design session. While it's inconclusive who the individual was that actually made that suggestion, and it was literally just an idea that someone threw out on the table for consideration as opposed to a fully thought-out design decision, the team immediately saw the value in making that idea a reality, and from that point forward, Samus Aran, badass space bounty hunter, would be a woman. The team making Metroid's world, environments, and alien creatures would also end up being influenced by popular film properties of the time, most notably Ridley Scott's Alien franchise, along with the work that famed artist H.R. Giger had contributed to those films' alien xenomorph design. Beyond simply influencing the design of bosses and creatures included in the game world, though, Alien would also drive the team to instill Metroid with a feeling of desolation and despair, a pair of emotions that was not typical in video games of the time. Most titles created around this point in history were either designed to be uplifting and fun, or potentially challenging but still heroic experiences. Metroid was designed to be none of that. The team wanted players to feel just how alone they were in exploring the game's desolate and hostile alien environment, and most aspects of Metroid's design reflected that overarching emotional goal. Eventually, after a mostly uneventful development cycle, Metroid would be ready for release on the market, and the title would hit Japanese store shelves in August of 1986. Upon its release, the game would be praised by critics and gamers alike as being a truly innovative gaming experience, with a combination of mechanics that had legitimately not been seen before. Beyond the item and skill-based progressions baked into the experience, which would eventually become the foundation of the entire Metroidvania gaming genre, Metroid would also be one of the earliest games to feature multiple endings, with different final scenes playing out depending on how quickly players would finish the game. Because the ending would change depending on the total time spent playing the title, Metroid would end up becoming one of the earliest titles to attract challenge-seeking speedrunners, a community of gamers that is pervasive across the industry today, but back in the mid-80s, was much less prevalent. Metroid would prove to be incredibly innovative in a number of different ways, and gamers certainly took notice, with almost 3 million copies sold in the years following its release, and proof that Nintendo's R&D1 division, alongside Intelligent Systems, had just created another hit new franchise for the Big N. As you might expect, whenever a blockbuster title is released on the market, a sequel would become inevitable. Though here, the changing console landscape of the time would nudge Nintendo to go in a little bit of a different direction than what you might expect. I mentioned earlier that the R&D1 group at Nintendo wasn't just comprised of video game designers. No, that team also had hardware engineers, a cross-functional structure born out of Gunpei Yokoi's own multifaceted skill set. As Nintendo started to dominate the home console market in the mid to late 80s, the company would set its sights on even broader goals, and would task Yokoi's R&D team to come up with the concept for a portable gaming console that would allow on-the-go gamers to bring their favorite Nintendo titles with them wherever they may go, all designed in a package that could literally fit in their pockets. That assignment is what would lead to the eventual creation of the Nintendo Game Boy portable console in 1989. As a portable console, the Game Boy would, by definition, be more limited than any of the home consoles on the market at the time, though despite the limitations inherent by the device's portability, Nintendo still had high hopes for the release and eventual success of the console. Sure, the Game Boy would feature a 2-bit monochrome display as opposed to being able to utilize the colorful 8-bit palettes of then-modern video game consoles, and the screen would be much smaller than nearly any television screen, with a 2.6-inch screen capable of displaying a paltry 160 by 144 pixel resolution, in comparison to the higher resolutions of Nintendo's NES, and much lower than the company's forthcoming Super Nintendo Entertainment System. But despite those limitations, the Game Boy would be a full-fledged video game console, with the ability to use interchangeable cartridges to provide gamers with a variety of different gaming experiences to enjoy, and a number of high-profile Nintendo characters and franchises slated for release on the newly announced portable device. The thought being that Mario, Zelda, and other recognizable characters would be system sellers, and would help the Game Boy gain a foothold in the market. While history would prove Nintendo to be very, very right with that thought process, at the time the Game Boy was released, it was still uncertain as to how successful the Game Boy would end up being, so Nintendo was willing to pull out all the stops to make the system successful. This is why, shortly after the Game Boy hit the market, the system would become the home for the portable version of the latest Super Mario title, as well as being the landing spot for the eventual sequel to Metroid, Metroid 2: The Return of Samus. Before we continue our discussion on Metroid 2, we need to take a quick detour to talk about Mario's first outing on the Game Boy console, Super Mario Land. When Super Mario Land was first conceptualized, the goal was to give gamers the feel of a full-fledged Mario adventure, albeit in a much smaller, portable format. Despite that goal, though, the fact that Super Mario Land was a launch day title for the Game Boy, and was therefore one of the first games actually developed for the new console, would cause certain concessions to be made as the game made its way to store shelves. As is often the case, the games released earlier in a console's lifespan are usually less full-featured and more feature-constrained than titles released later in a console's lifespan, simply because developers learn a lot about a system's underlying capabilities and different tricks to extract every ounce of performance the more time they have to develop titles for that system. Super Mario Land was a Mario adventure, but it was considerably shorter and less graphically rich than other Mario efforts that had preceded it, and you could certainly see where concessions were made in order to shrink Mario down to a size that could fit on Nintendo's Game Boy portable console. I mention all of this because, by the time Metroid 2: Return of Samus launched on the Game Boy in late 1991, developers were much better versed in how to create meaningful Game Boy titles that didn't deviate quite so much from their home console relatives, and Metroid 2, perhaps more so than any Game Boy title released up to that point, would truly demonstrate that portable didn't equal lesser quality. In fact, Metroid 2 would be designed to be an evolution and improvement over the original Metroid, with graphics that were designed to be comparable to its 8-bit counterpart, streamlined and enhanced controls that would hopefully make the game feel even better to play than its predecessor, and the inclusion of a battery backup system that allowed players to actually save their progress rather than having to write down a long password in order to maintain their progression. While Super Mario Land was a title filled with concessions because of being a Game Boy title, Metroid 2 was the exact opposite. A Game Boy title that the development team at R&D 1 designed with enhancements rather than concessions in mind. With these hopeful improvements in place alongside the same addicting gameplay loop as the original Metroid title, it's not hard to understand why the game would be critically praised, mostly, and commercially successful, with nearly 2 million copies of the game sold in the years following its release, and further proof that the Metroid franchise, despite being only 2 games deep at this point, was a high-quality, worthwhile gaming experience with tons of fans around the world. Not every critic thought Metroid made the jump to the Game Boy quite as gracefully as others, but regardless, the fact is that Metroid 2 was a popular and successful release in the newly formed Metroid franchise. With 2 successes already released, a natural question might be, what's next for Metroid? Well, the answer to that question would eventually result in the creation of our game of the day, the Super NES classic, Super Metroid. The first indications that a Super Nintendo incarnation of Metroid was potentially on the way came in a mid-1992 edition of Nintendo Power, Nintendo's in-house published gaming magazine that, while mostly an advertising vehicle for Nintendo products, was still freaking awesome, and would often give interested Nintendo fans the inside scoop of the latest and greatest news alongside tips and tricks, strategy guides, fan letters, game reviews, and all of the other sorts of stuff you'd expect in a gaming magazine in the 80s and 90s. Nintendo would often use Nintendo Power to hint at potential future releases, and while not every game Nintendo Power teased would actually result in a full-scale release, more times than not, if Nintendo hinted at a first-party upcoming release, it was a pretty good bet that that release was going to happen. Such was the case with Super Metroid, which had been greenlit by Nintendo leadership earlier in 1992, before being added to Nintendo's pipeline as a fully approved project. Longtime Metroid teammates at Nintendo's R&D1 division, including the crew at Intelligent Systems, would be tapped on the shoulder to once again attempt to bring another Metroid title to life. Only this time, they had more power at their disposal than ever before, as the Super NES was dramatically more capable than the NES before it, and light years more powerful than the Game Boy that housed Samus Aran's newest adventure up to that point. As the team began brainstorming how to make this latest iteration of Metroid the best yet, they went back to review their prior games, making a list of things that they felt could be improved upon for this 16-bit entry in the franchise. Besides making the world of Super Metroid much larger and more detailed than any prior Metroid title, the team would also introduce improved and more responsive controls, streamlined map and open-world design to make exploring the game's environments that much more impactful, and equally impactful, a more refined and complex soundscape, inclusive of multi-layered sound effects and music that the game's design team hoped would serve to immerse players in the game's action more than prior games in the series. Interestingly, the team working on Super Metroid were in no hurry to bring the game to market, and the fact is, they didn't want to release a new Metroid title just to make some money. I mean, sure, a new Metroid title would be profitable. That much was a foregone conclusion. But unlike so many other game franchises that would be milked for profits as opposed to quality, Super Metroid was being created as only the 3rd game in the series, which at this point had existed for around a decade. 3 games in an ultra-popular series like Metroid over a 10-year span might sound like a missed opportunity for even greater profits, until you consider that Nintendo has always been protective of, and patient with, their prized franchises and characters, and the Metroid series, despite only having 2 released titles at this point in history, had already entered the rarefied air of other Nintendo heavyweights like Mario, Donkey Kong, and Zelda. The team behind Super Metroid was going to have as much time as they needed to make yet another worthwhile game. The only limit was going to be the talent of the team and their ability to continue to innovate on the Metroid formula. The only question was, would Super Metroid eventually hit the mark with consumers and critics? Or would it fail to live up to the 2 Metroid titles that preceded it? Well, the answer to that question would come in 1994, as after 2.5 years of development, Super Metroid would finally hit store shelves, and it would almost instantaneously become another smash hit for Nintendo and Intelligent Systems. Critics everywhere praised the game's design, graphics, control, sense of exploration, number of hidden secrets, music, progression-based gameplay, and nearly anything else you can think of, as Super Metroid would be universally recognized as one of the best games of the year, with a number of publications awarding it Game of the Year honors outright. Gamers, meanwhile, would be similarly impressed with the game, as it would go on to sell nearly 1.5 million copies in the years following its release, en route to becoming, in the eyes of many, one of the best games of all time. In fact, several gaming publications have even named Super Metroid to be the best game of all time, independent of console, era, and genre. Even retrospective analysis from a more modern perspective paints Super Metroid as being one of the best games of all time, a true classic that holds up remarkably well, and feels as good to play today as it did when it first released. Well, I'll relay my own opinion on the game in just a little bit. Suffice it to say, Super Metroid was, and is, beloved by millions of gamers around the world. The Metroid series itself would continue to expand and reinvent itself over the years, including forays into first-person perspective gaming, three-dimensional action experiences, and modernized, two-dimensional traditional side-scrolling titles. And while not every Metroid title has been considered an all-time classic, the vast majority of Metroid releases are cause for celebration, and countless fans around the world anxiously await any word of future Metroid releases. The latest release in the franchise, Metroid Prime 4, just came out in late 2025, and as of this recording, the series has expanded to include 17 different releases, with total sales eclipsing 20 million copies sold since the very first Metroid released, 40 years ago. Undeniably, the Metroid franchise is insanely popular and incredibly influential, and nowhere was that more evident than with the release of Super Metroid, a title that, in the eyes of many, remains one of the best games of all time, even today. My question, as I sat down to begin playing Super Metroid for today's episode of the podcast, was whether all of that hype and reverence was justified, or if Super Metroid, like my first impression of the title, was a good game and an important game, but not necessarily one of the best games ever made. That is just one of the questions we're going to answer as we begin diving even deeper into Super Metroid. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Super Metroid today versus when it was released over 30 years ago. The first thing to recognize as we begin talking about Super Metroid is that it is, in fact, a Metroid title, which brings with it certain expectations of the genre. Now, before we begin, we're going to talk about exactly what a Metroid title is. But before we begin, I do want to mention that I'm going to try to avoid using the term Metroidvania as we continue our discussion. The reason for that is that when Super Metroid first came out, the term Metroidvania didn't really exist. Metroidvanias are the combination of Castlevania-like gameplay with Metroid-like progression. Super Metroid is kinda, sorta, and if it were released today, it would almost certainly be called a Metroidvania, but in reality, Metroid and Super Metroid are Metroid games, and the core elements of those Metroid titles are what would eventually morph and meld with Castlevania to form the Metroidvania genre. So I'm going to try to avoid using the term Metroidvania as we talk about what makes up a core Metroid kind of game. The first thing to know, and this is going to apply to Super Metroid, everything we talk about is not just about the general Metroid genre, but it's really all about Super Metroid. The first thing to know is that you are going to explore a large, interconnected world. You don't know how big that world is going to eventually be because it's not like you start the game with a map or anything like that. When you first start exploring in Super Metroid, you have no map. You have no idea where the heck to go. You're kind of just dropped into this environment and you begin to explore. And the game does take place over a number of different zones eventually that will open up as you gain additional skills, abilities, and items to allow you to progress further into the game. As you start to explore this world, as is typical with most Metroid titles, you'll start to see areas that might be blocked off. There might be areas that you see have a green door in front of them and you think, there's got to be something cool behind that. And you try to go past that door and you realize that at this stage of the game, you cannot go that way. So you make a mental note to return to that location at some point in the future because undoubtedly something cool is hiding behind that door. You just can't get to it yet. Now, like I mentioned, you start the game without a map of any kind, and as you explore, your map will start to get filled out around you. Each of the game's major zones, though, do contain a map that you can download, which will give you a layout of that zone's general area, though that map layout is far from all-encompassing. One of the joys of Metroid games, and Super Metroid in particular, is the act of discovery. And while you might find a map for a given area that you're exploring, that map is not going to show you all of the different secrets that you might be able to uncover, all of the different rooms you might be able to explore. And the fact is that in Super Metroid, there are a ton of secrets to uncover and areas to explore. Many of them are hidden, meaning that you're going to look at the map, you're going to think, oh, I might have explored this whole area. No, you probably did not, because the maps, while good, and I do appreciate the inclusion of maps within the game, they do not show you everything that you need, and sometimes they don't even show you where you need to go to progress in the main quest of the game. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But for the most part, the maps give you a general structure of the area that you're exploring. They might show you different rooms that you haven't explored yet, because the map does kind of show you where you've been and where you haven't been. But at the end of the day, because of how many secrets and hidden areas there are to find, the map is really only a starting point to your overall exploration and adventure. As you explore that map and different locations within the game, you will find hidden areas. You will discover secrets. You're going to find different items that are going to help you in your overall adventure, and you're going to find different upgrades that will enable you to enhance your overall combat prowess. Now, upgrades will typically improve the total capacity of your ammo loadout, whether that's a standard issue missile, a super powerful warhead, or a screen-clearing mine, as well as the number of energy tanks at your disposal, which in Super Metroid represents your hit points. Those energy tanks, by the way, will become very, very useful because there's going to be a number of different spots in the game that you are going to take damage. The more energy tanks you have, the better. Beyond upgrades, you'll also find a ton of different items and gadgets to enhance your overall exploration of the game. And whether you have a given item or not will typically gate your progression, and that's fairly traditional with any sort of Metroid game, where, like I mentioned earlier, you might be exploring an area and you find a door that you know there's got to be something beyond that door, but you don't have the item or skill needed in order to progress through that door. That has become a staple of all Metroid games. That is a staple of the Metroidvania gaming genre, which I said I'm not going to mention all that much, but I will mention it occasionally. But that is a core staple of the entire gaming experience when you're talking about Super Metroid. Now, those upgrades and those items and those different skills or guns that you might find, they are incredibly diverse and varied. And based on what you pick up, they will enable you to explore different areas of the game world. As an example, let's say you find the Ice Beam. Well, earlier in the game, you might have found a long vertical shaft filled with enemies flying around, but no apparent way to progress upwards. Now that you have the Ice Beam, you can go back there, you can freeze those enemies, and use them as platforms to ascend the shaft. I've got to say, that one was fairly ingenious from my perspective. I really appreciated the fact that you could use the Ice Beam to freeze enemies in place and then use them as pseudo-platforms. That doesn't just apply to that one area of the game, because no spoilers really, but there is going to be a section of the game where you're going to see this vertical shaft. There's going to be a lot of enemies flying around, and you're going to wonder to yourself, how the heck do I get up there? The Ice Beam is the answer, but the Ice Beam is also useful in any number of other areas where it might allow you to progress to different areas of the game in a different sequence or a different way than what developers may have intended you to do. And that is also one of the core staples of the Metroid game, or the Metroid genre, which is you aren't necessarily going to be progressing to the different locations in the game world at the same exact way or pace or in the overall directional path that the game's designers and developers may have originally thought about, because you can use a number of these skills you get in any number of ways, and ingenious players have found ways to entirely sequence skip huge portions of the game simply by using the tools that developers have given you. The Ice Beam is one of those examples where now you can freeze enemies, you can use them as platforms. That opens up a ton of exploration possibilities. You might also, another example, you might find yourself walking into an area of the game world that is super hot. I'm talking sweltering heat that constantly depletes your hit points. Well, if you've acquired the Varia suit, then you're going to be fine. You'll feel nice and cozy as opposed to burnt and toasty. The Varia suit will enable you to explore those much hotter kinds of environments where before you get that upgrade, you're going to walk in there and you're going to think, uh-oh, I better leave quick because your hit points will deplete rapidly. And then finally, one final example, and there are a ton of examples. I'm not going through every single gadget and item in the game, but one other example is the grapple beam. There are different areas of the game where you might see a huge gap that you can't possibly jump across. Well, maybe there's an odd tile on the ceiling that acts as a grapple point, which if you have the grapple beam, you can then use to swing across to reach further into any given area. Like I said, it's not my intent to talk through every upgrade and item in the game, because the act of discovery is one of the best parts of any Metroid title. But suffice it to say, Super Metroid has a ton of items to find, and every time you find something, whether you're talking about upgrades, you might get 5 more missiles, or whether you're talking about a brand new gadget that lets you explore new areas of the game world, every time you find something, it will immediately spark interest into what areas you may need to go back to re-explore. And re-exploring previously visited areas is pretty much a staple of any Metroid title, and it certainly is a focus here as well. The cool thing is re-exploring an area never really feels like a chore, primarily because your map does a pretty nice job of letting you know where you've been and where you have yet to visit. Like we were talking about though, the map will not help with finding all of the game's secrets, because oftentimes the true hidden stuff in the game will not be marked on your map until you yourself discover it. I felt that the game strikes a good balance between giving you the information you need and allowing you the joy of discovery yourself, which I appreciated more and more as I continued going through the game. That said, as with any game where you need to re-explore similar areas that you've already been through, it is possible that you may experience a little bit of tedium, especially late in the game when you've pretty much been everywhere and are trying to remember that one spot that you couldn't fully explore earlier in your playthrough. Tedium doesn't set in often, but I will admit, in the very late game, I did spend some time wandering aimlessly just to try to figure out what to do next. One reason for that is that my notes weren't nearly as detailed as they should have been, but another reason for that aimlessness is that Super Metroid commits what I consider to be a bit of a sin for this style of game, which is to lock required progression items behind completely hidden secret areas of the game world. I completely respect requiring players to explore your world in order to progress in the game. I just have a slight issue with completely obscuring certain sections of the game world that contain required progression items. If you want to tackle this one without a walkthrough or guide, be prepared for some moments of not knowing where the heck to go until you finally stumble upon a hidden path that leads you on to your next objective. And to note, I do recommend you avoid using a guide with this game as much as possible, as like I mentioned, the sheer act of discovery and exploration here is pretty much peak gaming. Anyway, if you explore enough, you will eventually progress deeper into the game, and as you continue to explore, you may discover certain hidden mechanics and skills that were available to you from the very start of the game, but you would have no way of knowing of their existence. Learning to pull off these moves requires watching various creatures in the game world execute those same maneuvers, and assuming you have a pretty good controller with a solid D-pad at your disposal, you should be able to pull off some pretty impressive moves which can potentially allow you to skip sections of the game that would otherwise be blocked off to you until you acquired a more direct skill or item to use. Take that vertical shaft example from before. You could wait to explore up above until you get the freeze beam. Or, if you had any inkling of the fact that you could wall jump, you could technically scale that shaft independently, without needing to use the freeze beam in the first place. I thought the fact that these secret skills existed right under your nose was awesome, though I will admit that some, in particular that wall jump move, can be tricky to pull off consistently, especially if you're using a controller without a good D-pad. If you're trying to pull off some moves but can't reliably execute them, it may not be a skill thing. It may truly be a controller thing, because in the case of the wall jump, Super Metroid is pretty darn precise with how you need to execute that move. If you accidentally trigger diagonal movement, which on lesser quality D-pads is really easy to do, you may have extreme difficulty getting your wall jumps to land. In this case, it pays to have the right tool for the job, because an inferior D-pad will hamper your enjoyment of the game. at least as it relates to these hidden maneuvers. All that said, you don't need to use those special maneuvers to progress in the game, as Super Metroid's core progression is very focused on acquiring items and visible skills, not utilizing hidden skills. And let me tell you, the sense of progression that pervades nearly every moment of gameplay is hard to top. There was hardly a moment that passed where I didn't feel some sort of progression or sense of accomplishment, whether that was finding a new room I hadn't been to before, a brand new item that I just knew was going to let me explore further into the game, or a simple weapon capacity upgrade that helped improve my combat prowess. This sense of constant progression, coupled with the outstanding world, enemy design, and degree of exploration available, makes for an addictive gameplay loop, and one that drove me to play the game for hours straight, each time I sat down to continue exploring Super Metroid's world. Now, regardless of how much fun it might be to explore a world in a game, if that world is empty, the experience may be less than enjoyable. Luckily, however, Super Metroid is filled with interesting enemies to defeat, environmental obstacles to overcome, and bosses to destroy. So much so that sometimes, just discovering a new enemy encounter is enough to make you smile. The movement and combat in Super Metroid is pretty great, though I will say that it may take you a little bit of time to get used to the game's platforming mechanics, which from my perspective can feel a little bit floaty at times. Not a huge deal, but if you're used to the picture-perfect and tight platforming of, say, the Super Mario Bros. Franchise, you may experience some early difficulty and missed platform landings. It will not take you long to acclimate, but it is something that bears mentioning. Something else you may need to get used to is the mechanics for the various boss fights sprinkled throughout the game, which, as you might expect, all feature specific patterns to be learned before you can reliably defeat them. That said, a good chunk of the bosses in the game can be brute forced, meaning you don't really have to learn all of the ins and outs of each boss's movement patterns in order to emerge successful. You simply need to damage them quicker than they can damage you. This is going to be highly dependent on the combat upgrades you have at your disposal, the number of energy tanks you found, and your overall combat skills, so it's not a foregone conclusion that you'll be able to trade blows directly with any given boss in the game. And yes, some bosses will require you to actually play the fight as the game's designers intended, avoiding attacks, using the environment to your advantage, and hopefully, eventually emerging victorious. Some other bosses, though, cool concepts, but as long as you have the right firepower, you can overcome their attacks by simply overpowering them. There are a good number of bosses in the game, with several mega bosses that ultimately block your overall progression towards the end of the game, and as you might imagine, some of those bosses can be pretty tricky, so much so that you might die on occasion. Luckily, Super Metroid features a save game mechanic where as long as you find a special save game room somewhere nearby, you can save your progress and restart from that position if you end up dying. While the fact that you can't save anywhere is a decidedly older school design paradigm, the good news is that save points are placed pretty much all over the map, and you'll rarely find yourself losing much progress if you die, assuming you're exploring sufficiently to uncover all of the different save points scattered around the game's world. Save points, like many points of interest, will be marked on your game's map, though sometimes the map will betray you. The way the map works is that it shows blocks representing each of the rooms in the game world, and oftentimes those blocks might share a common wall. Well, just because two blocks share a common wall doesn't mean you can walk from one room to the next, as they may be sharing a wall that can't be passed. More modern Metroidvanias and Metroid-styled games might show the actual paths that connect disparate rooms, making it so that you know where one room may lead, as opposed to needing to guess whether two rooms are connected by a door or not connected at all. This isn't a huge deal in Super Metroid, but it is something to watch out for, because you may be exploring an area of the world and assume you can move from point A to point B fairly easily, only to discover that that's very much not the case. In those instances, you may need to go on an entirely roundabout way to reach your goal, which can be a little frustrating, but is more times than not exhilarating, especially the first couple times you're exploring one of the game's many zones. I cannot stress enough how much fun it is to explore Super Metroid's world, learning new secrets and discovering hidden power-ups along the way. While there are a couple of things here and there that I believe may detract from your enjoyment of the game, none of my critiques are showstoppers, and in fact, when looked at holistically, Super Metroid is one phenomenal game. We're going to talk more about just how phenomenal Super Metroid is in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box. Because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Super Metroid for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the back of the box says, Super Metroid. Team up with the strength of Samus for a Super Metroid clash. Take on a legion of space pirates and a new Metroid force as you forge into the covert underworld of Planet Zebes. It's up to you and Samus to recapture the long-surviving Metroid hatchling before evil hands unleash its energy. An army of ominous creatures are poised for battle at every turn of Zebes' twisted, threatening passageways, including the menacing Ridley and the great lizard Kraid. Knock down enemies with a killer somersault and swing on an electric beam through narrow passageways. They're no match for you and Samus. But wait! It seems the mother brain has returned. And then some bullets. 24 megs of action in the largest Super NES game ever. It's the toughest Metroid clash yet. 6 huge areas to explore. Samus has an arsenal of new beams, missiles, and super high-tech devices. And finally, battery-backed memory saves your progress. So that was the back of the box for Super Metroid, and I've got to say, today, that box sells me entirely on the game. Back when I was younger, I wasn't really into Metroid. I didn't play the original Metroid. I didn't play Metroid 2 back on the Game Boy. I did not play or own or even ever rent Super Metroid back when it was out on the Super NES. Looking at the box today, I can certainly see the allure, and there are some screenshots, by the way, on the back of the box that make the game look really good and interesting. So today, yeah, 100%. I would buy this game if I saw it sitting on a store shelf. Back when I was younger, I just wasn't really into the whole Metroid genre, the Metroid franchise. I knew of it, but I really wasn't into it at all. And I don't know why that was. That was definitely a mistake on my part, knowing what I do now. But definitely the box, looking at it today, it absolutely sells me on the game. Moving on from the back of the box to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The simple fact is that Super Metroid is a great looking game. All of the environments instill dread, just as the designers intended. The enemy design goes above and beyond. It is truly top-notch seeing all of the different enemies in the game, especially the bosses, which are huge and highly detailed. The game is visually impressive, and certainly uses all of the Super Nintendo 16 bits to great effect. I have no complaints about the graphics in the game. The animations are smooth, everything moves around, there's really not any sort of slowdown at all that I remember experiencing. This is one visually appealing game. Moving on to the sound and music, they're pretty much as good as the graphics. I mean, the sound and music in the game is legitimately pretty darn awesome. And it's very effective at making you feel isolated and alone. Now, I will say that there isn't a ton of what I would consider melodically pure music. You're not going to see a bunch of different themes other than maybe the main theme for the game that you're going to think, oh yeah, that's a recognizable piece of music. But the fact is, that was never the intention of the game's composer. The intent of the music in Super Metroid was to make you feel like you were a singular, albeit badass, space bounty hunter, exploring a world filled with things that wanted to kill you. And in that capacity, the music definitely delivered. Sound effects, meanwhile, were all perfect and meshed very well with the action on the screen. So overall, I have no complaints from an auditory perspective. Moving on to the narrative and story, Super Metroid is a direct continuation of Metroid 2, which ends with heroine Samus Aran discovering a baby Metroid that she decides to escape with, as opposed to her initial mission of obliterating the Metroid species. As Super Metroid begins, you have brought that baby Metroid to a group of scientists who believe they can harness its energy for the good of all humankind. Unfortunately, resident space pirate leader Ridley discovers the location of the baby Metroid and decides to kill all of those scientists and Metroid nap that baby, taking it to the planet Zebes. Samus obviously cannot allow this crime to go unpunished, so she follows Ridley to Zebes, at which point her latest adventure truly begins. Will Samus be able to stay alive as she explores a heavily fortified space pirate world? That's up to you to decide. I've got to say, I thought the story here was great for this style of game. While the story really only bookended the experience and the majority of the game was spent without any sort of direct narrative being delivered to the player, I still appreciated its inclusion, as I thought it did a nice job giving you a reason behind why you were going on this adventure in the first place, and also provided strong continuity with Samus's prior adventure. Super Metroid's story is not super deep or expansive, but it honestly doesn't need to be. There's just enough here to make you want to learn more, and for a Metroid-style 2D platforming adventure, that is perfectly fine for me. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked pretty extensively about the general structure of the game and its gameplay, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I will say though is that the controls are pretty darn tight. Mostly, other than the jumping floatiness I mentioned earlier, and the fact that this is a game that rewards precise controls over button mashing, which means you really do want to use a good controller when playing this game. I know this might sound odd, because I don't often talk about needing to use a certain controller in order to truly enjoy one of the games we cover, but here, I'm speaking from first-hand experience. I began playing the game using a standard Xbox controller with a dedicated D-pad, not the round pseudo D-pads that come with many controllers nowadays, and I thought that I would be fine because that D-pad works perfectly well with most of the older games I've used it with. What I noticed with Super Metroid though, is that the game requires more precision than the Xbox D-pad can reliably provide, especially when trying to execute the game's wall jump. Now, one might argue that making the wall jump require so much precision, while other games have featured effective wall jumps that were much simpler to pull off, might in fact be a design flaw with Super Metroid itself. And honestly, I do not disagree with that argument. What I will say though, is that the more advanced maneuvers in the game will feel much better if you use a controller known to have an accurate and reliable D-pad. Some of you are probably wondering why I keep harping on that whole D-pad thing, and the simple answer is that trying to wall jump in the game, which once again is not required, was probably the most frustrating experience I had while playing the game. And it is also one of the very few criticisms I actually have of the game, because the majority of the experience, from beginning to end, is simply so good that I kinda have to nitpick to find anything critical to discuss. Things like the D-pad wall jump thing, or the fact that the map doesn't show room interconnections, or the fact that some bosses can be brute forced rather than needing to observe and learn their attack patterns. Those are all fairly nitpicky things to focus on, but they're pretty much all I've got if you want to hear me say anything even remotely negative about the game. Because Super Metroid is, quite simply, a masterpiece otherwise. So, what is our verdict on Super Metroid? Well, my latest playthrough of Super Metroid surprised me. Like I mentioned earlier, my first impression of the game several years ago was positive, but not necessarily mind-blowing. I thought the game was good, and I recognized its significance from a historical perspective, but I didn't walk away from that playthrough truly understanding the hype. Playing through it for this podcast episode, though, I now get what all the fuss is about. I don't know what I was thinking years ago when I first played the game, but I can confidently say that whatever thoughts I may have been having were absolutely misplaced, because Super Metroid is undoubtedly a true classic, and is unequivocally deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. In fact, it is so good, and was ultimately so influential to future titles, that I believe it belongs in the smaller contingent of pantheon entries that are legitimately all-time greats. Super Metroid is beyond a shadow of a doubt an all-time classic, and there's not really much more to say about it, other than to reaffirm that Super Metroid absolutely belongs in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is now time for this week's set of gaming challenges, and they are all, of course, focused on Super Metroid. Your first challenge, worth a single coin, is to narrowly escape an explosive situation. Early in the game, you will be faced with an explosive situation, which you are going to want to escape. If you can do that, you will earn 1 coin. Your second challenge is to find a friendly crew of wall jumpers. I mentioned that there are some secret mechanics hidden in the game, and you might need to observe certain animals and creatures in order to learn those mechanics. If you can find the crew that teaches you how to wall jump, you will earn 2 coins. And finally, your final challenge for the week is to reach Ridley's lair. This happens very late in the game. If you can reach Ridley's lair, you don't have to beat Ridley, but if you can reach Ridley's lair, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Super Metroid. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Dynamite Headdy, so definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience, and get your comments featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Dynamite Headdy. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.